So I'm sure as y'all who are already subscribed to me know, I am not the biggest fan of xenogenders, and this video popped up in my recommended. Before going forward, I want to make it very clear that I do not condone harassing this creator, being rude to them, or doing that to anyone who supports them. This video exists for the purpose of criticism, not as a hit piece or to hurt this creator. This video is going to be a little different than my other content. Currently, as of writing and recording this portion of the video, I have not actually watched it, and have only read the description and a few comments. The first section will essentially be a blind reaction and unscripted, and the later half will be a scripted response with sourcing and etc, etc. While I feel like there won't be much I agree with on the basis of the description alone, if there are things that have truth to them, I'll be discussing that as well, obviously. If you like my content and want to support it, please check out my affiliate links in the description and check out my Discord server. With all that out of the way, let's just get into the video. Before I start with this part, I just want to apologize for the kind of wonky setup. I tried to download the video and I couldn't get anywhere to download it with audio, so unfortunately this is what we're working with, and I don't usually make content reacting to things, so I'm not entirely sure of this setup. I also want to note that I am kind of going to interject more than needed to, just because I want to avoid copyright issues, and I apologize for that, so yeah.
Hey everyone, it's me, Daisy /Kekma /Roman /Cubidite, or whatever else you know me as. Today I'm deviating from my usual style and diving into a more psychologically focused topic, neurodivergence and gender. As a late diagnosed autistic person, I want to share my personal experiences and insights about neurodivergent individuals, particularly autistics, and their struggle with gender identity.
I want to make a little note here. I am autistic. I was diagnosed with, I guess, like, medium functioning, medium support needs, whatever word you want to use, level 2, whatever. Whenever I was around 10 or 11, technically I was just diagnosed with autism with like no specific label whenever I was around 10 or 11, but I was reassessed for insurance purposes as an adult, which is where the level 2 part came from, as that did not exist whenever I was initially diagnosed. But I just want to make that clear going forward, because it's not something that I bring up like a lot on my channel.
While also defending the idea of xenogenders and neopronouns. That basically sums it all up. Let's get on to the actual video. In the world of psychology, the term neurodivergence refers to individuals whose brain processes information differently compared to the majority of the population. This includes ADHD, dyslexia, and even autism. In this video, I'll be mainly focusing on autistics, as psychological studies have shed light on the challenges they face in their gender identity. As an autistic person,
I want to note that it's interesting that they don't cite any of these studies. I don't necessarily disagree with that claim, because whenever I go into the scripted part, I'm probably going to end up coming back to a few studies that I've talked about before. So I don't necessarily disagree with that, but it is worth noting that the sources consist of a gender wikia page and a card, neither of which cite like actual, real sources. And I don't know if they just didn't have it on hand or what, but maybe that's a nitpick, because not sourcing properly or using things that are not good sources is a very big pet peeve of mine, and I will also be talking a bit more about the sourcing situation later. But
a somewhat atypical experience growing up. I've always been true to myself and never really tried to mask my behavior or interest. However, this has occasionally led to social isolation, as others often perceive my blunt and straightforward nature as strange or weird. Over the years, I've realized that I prefer having a small circle of genuine friends who understand my unique perspectives rather than the many shallow connections based solely on conformity. Through the course of my life, I've come...
No negative comments here. That is something that I agree with, that I've also experienced, especially as someone who is pretty much entirely unable to mask, and it's kind of created a lot of problems in that I just either don't understand or refuse to comply with things if I either don't understand why something is a social norm or I don't agree with it. Like, it's explained to me and I get it, but then I'm like, okay, well, that's dumb though, so I'm not doing that. So I understand that. Again, I'm just trying to interject for copyright reasons, but no criticisms there. That's a valid experience. I feel that.
that I don't feel a strong connection to their traditional gender identities. I've explored the gender spectrum extensively, and although I was born a female, I don't feel like a woman or a man. I often feel disconnected from my body and gender, and I identify as more as a sentient being rather than having a specific gender. This feeling is common among neurodivergent individuals, especially those on the autism spectrum. Studies in psychology have shown that individuals on the spectrum often experience atypical gender identities when compared to neurotypical individuals. This divergence in gender...
I am still wondering where these sources are. The source that I have regarding this specifically, again, that I'll go into more later, does not necessarily imply that autistic people are more likely to experience atypical gender identities. Well, personally, like, I support non-binary. I don't really care whether that's true or not. The sourcing thing is just really getting to me because none of these sources are linked or named. And, like, as much as I agree that, like, that's fine, the fact, like, the actual number of it, I don't know if that's true or not because I don't know where they found that information.
It has led to the creation of terms like neopronouns and other gender-related terms that autistic individuals feel more comfortable using. These terms serve as a means of expressing one's unique gender identity and feeling comfortable in their own skin. However, there are still those who criticize this usage, particularly in neurotypical individuals.
I have heard a lot more autistic people criticize the usage of xenogenders and neopronouns than I have neurotypical people. Obviously, my experience is not universal, and they very well could have the opposite experience. But personally, as an autistic person, it is part of the reason that I have an issue with them is that they are kind of scapegoated. Like, autism is used as a scapegoat for these things. And I really do not like that. I think a lot of the arguments used for it have a plethora of problems that are just not addressed, or that are dismissed with basically like, well, it doesn't hurt anyone, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but we'll get to, or I don't necessarily agree with, but we'll get to that later. But, like, no. I mean, maybe for them, but even if it's completely true that they have only heard, or majority heard, neurotypical people criticize it, that is the complete opposite experience that I have had, and if anything, that just cancels each other out.
Individuals have faced a lot of stigma and judgment surrounding their gender identities. Society often invalidates our experiences and expects us to conform to a typical gender role. The use of neopronouns and unique gender identities is a way for neurodivergent people to reclaim their autonomy and assert their identities in the face of prejudice and ignorance. However, some critics argue that these terms are unnecessary or simply a way to seem more unique. But this argument is often misguided and dismissive.
I will note that's not really my personal issue with them. I think that is a very weak argument. Even if I still disagree with xenogenders, I think the idea of like, oh, they're just to seem more unique is not super helpful. Even if that is, whether that's true or not, it doesn't really address why people do that or things like that. I have an entire video, like, much less like, obviously I haven't talked about a lot of sources now, but I will later in the video. Obviously less like sourced, and it's not a scripted video or anything. It's more like this is me kind of rambling in between the video. But ultimately, that is a weak argument. It is not the reason that I think people use xenogenders, but it is also not the only argument, and maybe they'll get to that. Let's just see. I just wanted to note that I don't necessarily agree with that argument. I don't think it is a very strong one.
Crucial to remember that the use of neopronouns and unique gender identities is not for neurodivergent individuals to feel unique, but rather a genuine expression of their true selves. They don't use these terms for attention or to stand out. They use them because they feel more comfortable and aligned with their identities. The attack on these terms is not only harmful, but also stems from a lack of understanding and empathy for the complexities of gender and neurodivergence.
I completely disagree with that, but we'll get to it later.
Typical individuals may try to reclaim these terms without fully understanding or connecting with their meaning. While I don't believe in gatekeeping language, it's important to recognize that there is a difference between using these terms authentically and appropriating them for one's own benefit. It can be frustrating.
Xenogenders were created on Tumblr by a neurotypical person. That does not necessarily invalidate their usage or connection by neurodivergent people, but I think that is a worthwhile thing to consider if we're going to discuss neurotypical people using them.
And dismissive of the struggles that neurodivergent individuals face to see these terms used casually or without genuine intent. In my experience, I have seen individuals who misuse these terms for perceived clout or for the sake of appearing unique, which is both irritating and disrespectful for those who genuinely identify with these terms. While the use of neopronouns and unique gender identities is often dismissed as unnecessary or even attention-seeking, it is essential to remember that this expression is merely not a trend or a fad. It is an integral part of the lived experiences through neurodivergent individuals, particularly autistics. They use these terms to feel more like themselves and to express their identities in a world that often shuns and misunderstands them. To dismiss their identities is to invalidate their experiences in the very fabric.
Not every experience needs to be validated. The idea of validating people's feelings or emotions about certain things, yes, I think that's fine. That's something that I've personally come to terms to a lot with therapy, that your feelings on something can be valid and genuine without necessarily being a proportionate response or justifiable. And I think there's a difference between validating the fact that people feel a certain way and that it is fine that they feel that way, and then validating the conclusion that they come to on the basis of those feelings. Those are two different things. I totally understand that people may genuinely identify with these terms, and I'm not trying to go around saying, no, you don't actually feel that way. I am trying to say, okay, maybe you actually feel that way. That is not the correct way to describe that, and the way that you are describing it causes harm. It is the conclusion instead of the feeling itself.
Neurodivergent individuals have been historically underrepresented and misunderstood in discussions about gender and identity. Studies show that their perception of gender identity varies from that of neurotypical individuals, and that they...
Where are these studies? Because the studies that I have read do not say that, and I would be much more willing to accept that claim if these studies were cited, and they are not.
Often struggle to fit into societal gender norms. Their connection with gender may not be as clear-cut as it is for neurotypical individuals, and some find much more comfort in expressing themselves through terms beyond the traditional male-female binary. Ignoring their...
Okay, again, no issue with non-binary, but I think it's not comparable to compare gender identities like agender or just simply non-binary or demi-boy or girl or whatever to things like my gender feels soft and fluffy like a cat. Those things are not really remotely similar.
In gender identities perpetuates the cycle of exclusion and misunderstanding, further alienating those who already face significant challenges in society. The use of neopronouns and unique gender identities by autistics is not something we can dismiss as an unimportant matter or a trivial change. These terms provide a sense of identity and validation to individuals who have struggled to fit into typical gender roles. This struggle is especially apparent in late...
I'm sorry, but I do not think the idea that something needs to be validated just because someone feels strongly about it is a valid argument. The idea that people just need to be validated constantly is wrong. If you validate something harmful or incorrect, you are perpetuating that cycle of misinformation and harm. The same way that I am not going to validate a religious person's religious beliefs being legitimately true, but I will validate that maybe, hey, you actually feel that way and you have your reasons for feeling that way, but that's not true. I'm not going to pretend it's true. I'm not going to do that for xenogenders either. I genuinely believe that religious people actually believe the things that they are saying, for the most part, and that they actually have reasons for feeling that way. That does not mean that I have to validate the conclusion that they come to is a legitimate real thing. Again, same thing with xenogenders. Validation is not as clear-cut as, is this a, correct, your label is good. I don't care what the label is, good, yes, yay, don't care. You can validate someone's feelings or experiences without validating the conclusion that they come to on their basis.
Most autistics like myself, who have spent a lifetime masking their true selves. Using these terms also allows them to reclaim their own identities and experience a sense of security and acceptance within themselves. Dismissing these terms only serves to invalidate the struggles of neurodivergent individuals. Many people also don't realize that xenogenders are more than just quirky labels or words. They're profound connections with gender. Think of it this way. Imagine if gender was like a piece of music. For some people, the traditional masculine and feminine labels are like the most common keys or instruments. But for others, their gender may feel like a whole different genre or instrument altogether, like jazz, reggae, or even a harp. It's about finding words and symbols that resonate deeply with how they experience gender.
That's not what gender is. I could see that being used as a description of non-binary, but that's xenogenders are more maybe male and female is classical music, and then agender is jazz and bigender is rock or whatever, right? And then xenogenders are whenever you say, hey, what's your favorite genre of music? And they say, I really like baseball. It's closer to that than a different genre of music. I'm sorry, but that's not a correct analogy because that's not how gender works.
Summary. The main issue with the backlash against the use of neopronouns and unique gender identities is a fundamental lack of understanding for the genuine struggles that neurodivergent individuals face in finding their place in society.
No, because neurodivergent people also criticize these ideas.
Terms weren't originally just attention-seeking fads, but rather a profound expression of one's gender identity. Xenogenders serve as a powerful metaphor for gender, connecting individuals to their true selves on a deeply personal and meaningful level.
We're going to discuss the metaphor thing later, because I have a really big issue with the connection to autism and saying that it is a metaphor for your personal experience with gender, but we will go into that in the scripted part because I am not coherent enough unscripted to explain that here. Okay, so scripted part. I'm a bit of a mess unscripted, especially having to do that all in one take, but I guess I just wanted to show my initial thoughts before diving deeper into the ideas presented here. I also want to note my stance on a few things first and foremost, because most of these are ideas that are scattered throughout various videos on these specific topics. I also want to reiterate that I am a diagnosed autistic person with notable support needs, as well as have been out as a trans man since around 2015-ish. I am in complete support of non-binary, and I actually have really minimal issues with neopronouns such as ze, zer, or other words that were created for the sole intent of being gender-neutral pronouns aside from they, them. While I don't personally understand why someone would choose to use pronouns like ze or the like over they, them, and I do wish that there was a more standardized or agreed upon set of third-person pronouns for just like ease of communication, I ultimately don't think things like that are harmful. I don't get them, but they're kind of just whatever. I don't really care that much. The purpose of English third-person pronouns is to indicate the gender of who is being spoken about and to simplify sentence structure over repeatedly using proper nouns. Pronouns like zer accomplish the goal of indicating a non-binary identity while still generally fitting within the sentence structure. I do, however, have an issue with noun pronouns. While I wouldn't say they're harmful necessarily, though some of the arguments stemming from them can be, they do not accomplish the goal of indication of gender, and they dramatically decrease coherency in a sentence. Not only due to them stemming from existing nouns that have existing meanings, which is obviously confusing, but also because using them in certain contexts can be like mind-numbingly confusing, specifically if the noun pronoun is being used in the same sentence as the actual noun. While I don't think all cases of using these are harmful, if not just rather pointless, the common argument about neurodivergency surrounding them absolutely can be. Well, based on the pinned comment, this creator does not seem to agree with the idea that people should be required to use others' noun pronouns. It's not uncommon for people to become extremely defensive or even outwardly aggressive when they're not used, which in my experience often results in some variety of accusations of ableism. This is kind of ironic, considering the main issue I have with them personally is a result of my audio processing issues. I am currently in the process of testing to see if I have audio processing disorder, or if the issues may just be a result of my autism. However, this makes these sentences downright impossible to understand when spoken aloud. And while I'm not dyslexic myself, I have spoken to dyslexic people who have an incredibly hard time understanding them when written. I think this is more so that the culture surrounding them is harmful than the words themselves. There's a level of defensiveness and aggression that's seemingly ever present in these communities, that any disagreement or even questioning is absolutely unacceptable and is transphobic or ableist. I know someone who will use people's noun pronouns for them and yet has been sent death threats over essentially going, I do not agree with you using this, but I respect you, so I'm not going to call you something else if you don't want to be called it. I've personally been doxxed and received threats as well as graphic images for publicly disagreeing with these things. I'll get back to my opinion on the root of this issue a little later, but the TLDR of my issue is more so with the community surrounding them than their usage as like a, I like this, but you don't have to use it basis. I obviously do not support xenogenders. I do not believe that they are used to be special, at least in most cases, but out of a mixture of misinformation perpetuated by many people who defend or use them, an inability to understand gender on a more research-based level, and sometimes honestly just being young and trying to figure out your identity in a way that's often removed later. While I take the same issues in the culture surrounding them that I do with noun pronouns, as well as the spread of misinformation, I don't think the vast majority of xenogender users are disingenuous or malicious. I think they're misguided or misinformed. Lastly, because I will be diving into self-diagnosis just a little bit in this video, I am not in support of self-diagnosis in any way in which it is made public. I don't necessarily support it privately either, as it's generally unproductive, but ultimately if it's kept private, it's no longer my problem. A very recent video discussing online self-diagnosis, so I'll link that below, but my summary of why is that it claims to be helpful either in receiving a diagnosis or in self-management, and that is largely untrue and unsupported. It's also a rampant spreader of misinformation that tends to mute mutate as it gets spread around more and more among communities that don't actually have access to proper information. And that while I think the issues people often cite for doing it are real and legitimate, self-diagnosis is not an effective solution either on an individual nor systematic level. Again, I go into all of those points deeper and better in another video, so I'll leave it at that. I'm going to focus my criticism on xenogenders here, as I ultimately find noun pronouns to be more harmful in their communities and supporters rather than their usage as a whole. The argument of xenogenders being used as a result of neurodivergency is one that I've never really understood beyond the fact that people online who use xenogenders also often are autistic or self-identify as such. This is because neither the actual symptoms of autism nor established research really support this idea. When it comes to autism symptoms, there are two main ones I want to address: difficulty with abstract and metaphorical language or concepts, and inability to understand or unwillingness to comply with societal norms. When it comes to societal norms, I understand where I at least believe this argument to be coming from, but ultimately it's very flawed. I absolutely understand both aspects of this, both being unable to understand when certain social norms are expected or how to apply them, making it so that I'm unable to follow them, as well as social norms that I conceptually understand but do not understand why anyone values or follows them and as such reject to do so. I am not someone who is able to mask, even after being forced into ABA therapy, which is essentially let's be abusive until you're forced to mask. I am unable to. While I respect autistic folks who do mask and make a choice to unlearn that behavior, it's not something I've experienced. I don't work to unmask. I am unable to and have always been unable to do it. In regards to gender, I think the problem here is the conflation of gender identity and your own internal sense of gender with gender roles and the gender binary. The idea of gender roles and the concept of a binary is a socially constructed one that I fully understand autistic people being unable to either understand or unwilling to follow, as personally I don't see any value in those things myself either. But gender roles and binary are not the same thing as gender identity. The vast majority of research done on the origin of transness shows it to be biological, or more specifically neurological in nature. While these studies absolutely have more to do, and some that I'm really intrigued by their methods definitely would benefit from a larger sample size, though not all of them are small scale, they are generally in agreement about transness not being societal in any way, but as a result of internal structural differences in the brain. For note, all these studies that I've personally read will be linked below as well. There's also promising, but admittedly much more scarce, research into the idea of fetal hormone levels being impactful on someone's likelihood to become trans, as hormones in the first trimester are responsible for physical sex characteristics, while areas of the brain associated with transness are still significantly underdeveloped at this point in a pregnancy. The current hypothesis that is, again, supported but absolutely requires more research to be conclusive, is that more dramatic shifts in hormone balance may result in brains developing differently if it occurs after natal sex characteristics are formed. It's also worth noting that these studies are not as clear-cut as male or female brains, but rely on common trends, and that they consistently demonstrate that trans individuals actually have structural differences from cis folks as well as from their birth sex. The point of all that being that while expectations and labels used to explain gender are in fact social, the actual experience of gender identity is neither social nor binary, but does have, I guess you could say, boundaries that it sits within. While autistic individuals may struggle to understand the value of these social norms or even the labels used to describe their personal feelings on gender identity, our gender identities still sit within these bounds. I would have much less of an issue with xenogenders if they weren't considered genders, something I find to be neat about xeno-IDs, essentially xenogenders without the gender part. Their explanation and discussion often relies on denying current evidence-based understandings of gender identity and transness that would be largely beneficial to public understanding, medical care and coverage, and honestly, at least personally, understanding my own gender identity. Their existence is reliant upon misinformation. I feel like it's a pretty simple and agreeable statement to say spreading misinformation is bad, especially whenever that misinformation impacts a marginalized group. When it comes to the second issue I have with xenogenders being attributed to autism, this comes from their description as metaphorical or abstract descriptors of gender identity. It's a very well-known and common symptom of autism that autistic people struggle with metaphor and non-literal language. So saying that autistic people are more able to understand an abstract and non-literal descriptor over a straightforward one has never been something I've personally understood. Obviously, people have different levels of ability to understand these things, as both I and this creator used metaphor in videos as they used the music metaphor and I responded with the different one, but I do personally struggle to understand metaphor when it's spoken outside of contexts I'm well versed in, or often when used by people other than myself or people I don't know well. Obviously, I am not all autistic people, so I'm sure there are people both less and more able to understand these concepts than I am, but this is just one of those things that doesn't actually seem to align with the actual symptoms of the disorder versus the claims made on the behalf of xenogenders. Again, just because I don't personally understand that experience does not necessarily make it an invalid one, but I don't think that there's really any support for it being related to autism under this specific argument, as it contradicts with the actual symptoms associated with autism. It seems more in spite of the autism as opposed to as a result of it, I guess. The second point I mentioned earlier was regarding the uncited sources that claim autism is more likely to result in people using these identities. If this creator sees this video, or if anyone else has them, I am beyond happy to read their sources if provided, or even if they use the same sources as me and we understood them differently, to have a discussion about that. However, every article I've found in relation to transness and autism have been along the following lines. There are higher levels of autistic trans people over autistic cis people proportional to the population. Autistic people are able to make informed choices on gender-affirming care, but may need different care plans. More rigidity in beliefs and understandings as a result of ASD can make gender therapy, which is often required for a gender dysphoria diagnosis, more challenging, and autistic trans individuals are more likely to internalize mental health struggles as opposed to allistic trans folks or allistic and autistic cis folks. None of this research necessarily precludes their statements from being true, but also the claims that these ideas are based on actual scientific research seems extremely lacking when most studies either do not address it at all or come to some vague conclusion of more trans people are autistic. I'll reiterate that I'm happy to read whatever studies they're referencing, and maybe I'm nitpicking because of my own personal irritation with bad sourcing, but I just don't find this to be the case through any actual research. When it comes to my issues with them on a are they harmful level as opposed to just this is not true, I have a couple issues, and most of them are due to harmful misinformation as well as coming back to that community attitudes issue from earlier. I think the idea that xenogenders in themselves are ableist is flawed. However, many of the arguments made on their behalf absolutely spread misinformation on both autism and transness as a whole. I don't buy into the they make us look bad idea that many people seem to say when discussing this, and I have a whole video on that, but rather how it internally affects the community and how it affects those entering it or questioning their identity. The descriptors of autism in association with gender identity present a false picture of both autism and transness. Because this idea is so minimally supported, it often leads to hostility and aggression to even genuinely confused questioners or civil disagreement. While of course not all xenogenders or supporters conduct themselves in this way, and there's absolutely people on my side of the aisle who would fall under that same category, it seems to be an overwhelming majority. I hate to do a religion comparison, but I mean, I'm me, so what did you expect? But I'd compare it to something I discussed in one of my videos about religion, in which terms like respect my religion are surface-level harmless statements that create a greater ability for those beliefs to go unquestioned or challenged. When these statements are not used or are denied, there's any number of responses, often including aggression or why do you care, it doesn't affect you, while disregarding the stated ways in which it affects others. People with shaky beliefs often tend to resort to aggression or the creation of echo chambers to avoid unstable foundations being knocked over, and this is extremely evident within this debate. Beyond that, however, the misinformation provided essentially breeds more of this. Many people who use xenogenders, or even just trans people in general, are self-diagnosed autistic. Enough that multiple studies I acknowledged throughout this video use separate language regarding diagnosed and self-identified autistic people. While I'm sure a handful of these people actually are autistic, this creates a further and further pit of people creating their echo chambers, spreading the misinformation, then allowing the misinformation to evolve and expand as it's left unchallenged. This becomes even worse when people questioning their identity, be it of neurodivergency or transness, are thrown into the mix, giving them a broken foundation to start that journey on. Sentiments like don't get a diagnosis because you won't be able to get a job are entirely untrue, but extremely frequent statements. And statements like these can prevent people from actually acquiring assistance and accommodation they would benefit from if they're actually autistic, but also encouraging and egging on people who are not autistic to continue spreading a warped perspective from inside the bubble. Validation is also an issue here. I really don't like this idea that validating someone has to mean validating their beliefs. I absolutely believe the feelings of xenogender people are real and valid, however that does not mean that the conclusion they come to on the basis of those feelings or experiences needs to be validated as well. Disagreeing with someone using a certain label as a result of these experiences or pointing out incorrect information they came to that conclusion with does not equate to believing that they are intentionally lying or that they're malicious actors. Validating misinformation in order to validate their feelings can be harmful. It can validate people in staying stagnant in untrue beliefs and spreading them to others, as well as delay people from, well, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but from coming to terms with their actual gender identity and being able to move forward in their lives with that. Aside from that, no one is obligated to validate the beliefs others hold, not mine or yours. Respecting that they feel a certain way is reasonable and good, but whether it be xenogenders, religion, alternative medicine, or anything else, no one is obligated to agree with you just because your beliefs stem from a genuine and real personal experience. Ultimately, the argument of xenogenders and autism is one that really stands on shaky ground, to be as generous as possible. This is not supported by modern research and creates a cycle of misinformation that's harmful to our understandings of marginalized groups. I don't think that people using xenogenders are outright lying or that they mean to harm anyone, but intent does not always reflect consequences, and it's perfectly acceptable to call out unsubstantiated beliefs when they're presented to you. That's all I got today, guys. Thank you for watching. Ha det.